Everyone thinks they know why the American Revolution happened. Taxes, the Boston Tea Party, no taxation without representation. You probably learned it in school. You've seen the documentaries, you've heard the speeches quoted, and that version, the textbook version, the one that starts somewhere around 1763 with Britain trying to make the colonies pay for a war. That version isn't wrong. It's just about 15 layers too shallow. Because here's what nobody tells you. By the time the Stamp Act passed in 1765, by the time the tea hit the harbor in 1773, by the time the first shots were fired at Lexington in 1775, the thing that actually caused the revolution had already been happening for over 100 years, quietly, invisibly, in the gap between what the colonists believed they were and what Britain believed they were. That gap is what this video is about. Not the taxes, not the battles, not the famous speeches, though we'll get to all of those. The gap. Because once you see it, once you actually understand what was breaking down underneath all those events you already know, the American Revolution stops looking like a political dispute and starts looking like what it actually was, a tragedy. The story of two sides of the same family who spent generations drifting apart without realizing it, until one day the distance between them was so vast that no law, no compromise, no amount of goodwill on either side could bridge it. And the most heartbreaking part? It didn't have to happen. There were moments, real, documented, historical moments, where one different decision, one genuine act of political imagination might have changed everything. Where the revolution could have been avoided, where the colonies might have remained British, and the world we live in now would look completely unrecognizable. Those moments are what make this a tragedy rather than a triumph. So forget 1763, forget 1765, forget even 1689, which is where the most ambitious historians tend to start. The real story begins before any of that. It begins on a boat, with people who had no idea they were planting the seed of a revolution because they were too busy trying to build something they were convinced was the most British thing in the world. And to understand why that matters, to understand why people who loved Britain ended up fighting it, you first have to feel just how deep that love actually went. Because the colonists weren't reluctant subjects straining against an empire. They were enthusiastic ones, proud ones. People who organized their entire sense of who they were around being British. And that's what makes everything that follows so devastating. Picture Boston in 1720. Not the revolutionary city you're imagining. Not a city of angry colonists itching for a fight. Picture something more surprising than that. A city that looks, sounds, and feels aggressively, almost desperately British. The coffee houses where merchants argue politics. The printing presses churning out pamphlets debating the same ideas being debated in London. The church spires modeled on Christopher Wren's designs. The legal system running on English common law. The fashion, the furniture, the architecture, all of it oriented toward Britain like a compass needle pointing north. This is the thing that almost every account of the American Revolution glosses over, because it's deeply inconvenient for the story we prefer to tell. The colonists who would eventually fight for independence were not, for most of their lives, people who wanted to be anything other than British. They were people who wanted to be more British. Nathaniel Cole's grandfather came to Massachusetts in 1680. He came because Britain, specifically the idea of Britain, the constitutional settlement that was slowly taking shape in English political culture, represented something he believed in: rule of law, property rights, the notion that a man's home was his own and that no government could take it without cause. He didn't come to escape Britain. He came to build a version of Britain that actually lived up to its own principles. By the time Nathaniel is running his father's trading business in the 1720s, that inheritance is simply the air he breathes. He is British. He reads British newspapers when they arrive by ship, 6 weeks late and still eagerly devoured. He follows the debates in Parliament with genuine interest. When Britain goes to war with Spain in 1739, the War of Jenkins' Ear, a conflict so obscure it barely registers in most history books. Nathaniel Cole celebrates British victories in a Boston tavern with the same fervor as any man in Bristol or Leeds. He has never been to Britain. He has never needed to go. Britain is not a place to him. It is an identity. And this is equally true, perhaps even more intensely true, 800 miles south on a Virginia plantation. William Hartwell has read John Locke, Joseph Addison, and Alexander Pope. His house is furnished with pieces imported from London. His children are educated on the same curriculum as the sons of English gentry. He corresponds with men in London, merchants, lawyers, minor aristocrats. And those letters are not the letters of a provincial writing to his betters. They are the letters of an equal, a British gentleman who happens to live in Virginia. He is meticulous about this. The portrait above his fireplace shows him in a powdered wig and a coat that would not look out of place in Mayfair. He sits on the local court. He serves in the colonial assembly. He understands himself to be participating from a distance in the great British project of self-governance. The distance, he believes, is incidental. Now hold both of these men in your mind, Nathaniel in Boston and William in Virginia, because they represent something that is absolutely essential to understanding what comes next. These are not colonists straining against an empire. These are colonists who have organized their entire psychological existence around belonging to one, which means that when Britain begins, slowly, clumsily, almost accidentally, to signal that it doesn't see things that way, the damage is not political. It is personal. It is the difference between a policy disagreement and a betrayal. And betrayal, unlike policy disagreement, does not respond to compromise. It responds to one of two things: reconciliation or rupture. Britain would eventually choose rupture, but not yet, not for a long time. First, there is a century of something that looks, from the outside, like a perfectly functional relationship. But that is actually building beneath the surface the conditions for everything that follows. A century in which Britain barely governs the colonies at all. A century in which the colonists, left almost entirely to their own devices, quietly develop something that will make the coming collision inevitable. They develop the habit of freedom. And habits, once formed over 100 years, do not break quietly. Here's what that century actually looked like, and why it is, without question, the most underrated cause of the American Revolution that almost nobody ever talks about. Here is something remarkable that almost never appears in documentaries about the American Revolution. For roughly 100 years, from the mid-1600s through the mid-1700s, Britain barely governed the colonies at all. Not because it forgot about them, not because it didn't care, but because the empire had bigger problems closer to home. Civil war in England, the Glorious Revolution of 1689, wars with France, wars with Spain, wars with the Dutch, the constant, exhausting business of managing a global empire from a small island in the North Atlantic. The colonies were profitable. The colonies were growing. The colonies were, from London's perspective, doing exactly what colonies were supposed to do: generating trade, consuming British goods, expanding the reach of the empire without requiring much direct management. So Britain left them alone. And in that space, in that long, quiet century of being left alone, something happened that nobody in London noticed until it was too late to reverse. The colonists learned to govern themselves. Not in theory, in practice. Every colony had its own elected assembly. Those assemblies controlled taxation, passed laws, managed local affairs. They argued, compromised, made decisions, held elections. By the middle of the 18th century, men like Nathaniel Cole and William Hartwell had been participating in functioning democratic institutions for generations. This is critical, because it means that by 1763, when Britain finally turns its full attention to the colonies and decides it's time for them to start contributing more to the empire, it is not dealing with politically inexperienced subjects who don't know any better. It is dealing with people who have been running their own affairs for 100 years. And there's something else that happened in that century of neglect. It's something even more important than the political institutions. Go back to 1689. In England, the Glorious Revolution, the bloodless overthrow of King James II, and the installation of William and Mary produces something extraordinary. The English Bill of Rights, a constitutional settlement that establishes for the first time in English law that Parliament is supreme, that taxation requires consent, and that the government derives its authority from the governed. John Locke, writing in the immediate aftermath of 1689, provides the philosophical architecture for what just happened. Government exists to protect the natural rights of its citizens: life, liberty, property. If a government fails to do that, or worse, actively violates those rights, the people have not just the right, but the obligation to resist. In England, this is a description of what just happened, a historical justification for a specific political moment. In the colonies, it becomes something else entirely. It becomes a creed. Locke is read in colonial schools, colonial churches, colonial assemblies. His ideas don't land as dry political philosophy. They land as confirmation of what the colonists already believe about themselves, that they are a free people governed by consent, whose rights are not granted by a king but exist naturally and can never be legitimately taken away. Edmund Graves, sitting in his comfortable London study in the 1750s, has also read Locke. He considers himself a perfectly enlightened man. He believes in constitutional government, the rule of law, parliamentary supremacy. But here's the thing Edmund doesn't notice, the thing that almost no one in London notices, is that he and William Hartwell have read the same books and arrived at completely different conclusions about what those books mean. To Edmund, Locke's principles apply to British subjects governed by Parliament. Parliament is the legitimate expression of consent. If Parliament passes a law, that law has democratic legitimacy, because Parliament represents the people. To William, Locke's principles apply to him personally, to his assembly, to his community. The Virginia House of Burgesses is where his consent is expressed, because those are the men he voted for, the men who know his roads and his courts and his neighbors. A parliament 3,000 miles away, in which he has no representative, cannot claim to speak for him. Philosophically, constitutionally, by Locke's own argument, same books, same principles, completely different conclusions. And for about 100 years, that difference doesn't matter, because Britain isn't asking the colonists for anything that forces the contradiction into the open. Then comes 1754, and a war that changes everything. In 1754, a 22-year-old Virginia militia officer named George Washington leads a small force into the forests of western Pennsylvania, fires on a French patrol, and accidentally starts a world war. That's not an exaggeration. The conflict that begins in those Pennsylvania forests, called the French and Indian War in America, the 7 Years' War in Europe, eventually draws in every major European power and is fought across 5 continents. It is, by almost any measure, the first true World War. And when it ends in 1763, Britain emerges as the most powerful empire on earth. It also emerges broke, suspicious of its colonists, and convinced that the relationship between Britain and America needs to be fundamentally rearranged. That conviction is where the revolution really begins. But before we get to what the war produced politically, we need to talk about what it produced emotionally. Because the 7 Years' War is the first time large numbers of British soldiers and American colonists actually interact with each other in sustained, daily, unavoidable contact. And they discover something that shocks both of them. They don't particularly like each other. British officers trained in the European tradition of formal military discipline look at colonial militias and see chaos. They see men who argue with orders, who go home when their enlistments expire, who don't drill properly, who don't march properly, who seem constitutionally incapable of the kind of unquestioning obedience that European warfare requires. Lord Loudoun, the British commander in North America from 1756 to 1758, describes colonial soldiers in letters home with barely concealed contempt. They are, in his view, undisciplined, unreliable, and fundamentally unsuited to real military operations. Young George Washington, serving alongside British regulars, experiences the reverse of this contempt in real time. He applies for a commission in the regular British Army, a reasonable ambition for a man of his abilities and standing, and is told, politely but clearly, that colonial officers cannot hold commissions equivalent to regular British officers regardless of their merit or experience. A regular British captain outranks a colonial colonel by default. Washington never forgets this. Neither does Nathaniel Cole, who has a cousin who served in the campaign and comes home talking about how British officers commandeered colonial homes and supplies without compensation, treated local populations with indifference bordering on hostility, and made very clear that they considered the colonists a lesser category of British subject. That phrase, lesser category, is never actually used. It doesn't need to be. It is communicated through 100 small interactions, 100 casual assumptions, 100 moments where a British officer acts as though the fact of being born in America is itself a kind of deficit. William Hartwell hears these stories and files them away. He is not angry yet. He is puzzled. He considers himself a British gentleman. The idea that a British officer would treat him as something less than that is not infuriating, not yet. It is confusing. It doesn't fit his model of what Britain is. He adjusts his model slightly. He assumes it was individual officers, individual failures of manners and judgment. He does not yet conclude anything systemic. He will. Meanwhile, the war ends in 1763 with the Treaty of Paris. Britain takes Canada from France, Florida from Spain, and establishes itself as the dominant power in North America. It is an extraordinary victory. It is also an extraordinary bill. The national debt has roughly doubled during the war. Britain is now paying £4.4 million a year just in interest, a number so large that it consumes a significant portion of the entire government budget. And the new territories Britain has acquired require garrisoning. Troops must be stationed in North America to protect the frontier, manage relations with indigenous nations, and prevent the French from causing trouble in their remaining territories. Someone has to pay for those troops. In London, the answer seems obvious. The colonists benefited from the war. The war was fought, at considerable British expense, to protect colonial frontiers and eliminate French threats to colonial trade and expansion. It is only reasonable, Edmund Graves would call it elementary justice, that the colonies contribute to their own defense. He sits down to calculate what a fair colonial contribution might look like. He does not ask the colonies what they think. That omission, that single catastrophic failure to consult, is not born of malice. It is born of something more dangerous than malice. It is born of assumption. The assumption that the relationship between Britain and the colonies is the same relationship it has always been. That the colonists are subjects who will accept parliamentary decisions the way subjects always have. That 100 years of self-governance has not changed anything fundamental about the political expectations of the people on the other side of the ocean. Edmund is wrong about this in ways he cannot yet imagine. And in 1764, with the passage of the Sugar Act, the first in a series of revenue measures that will detonate one by one, were against the political identity the colonists have been building for a century, he is about to find out exactly how wrong. The bill has arrived, and nobody is ready for what happens when the colonists open it. So here's what Britain actually did between 1764 and 1767. And as you hear this, I want you to hold two things in your head at the same time. What each measure looked like from London and what it felt like from Boston and Virginia. because the gap between those two experiences is where the revolution lives. First, the Sugar Act of 1764. On paper, this is a trade regulation. Britain actually reduces the existing tax on molasses from 6 pence per gallon to 3 pence, but pairs it with something new and alarming: serious enforcement. For decades, colonial merchants like Nathaniel Cole had been smuggling French molasses through the Caribbean with the cheerful complicity of customs officials who looked the other way for a modest bribe. The Sugar Act ends that arrangement. Royal Navy ships begin patrolling colonial waters. Customs officers get new powers. Violators face trial not in colonial courts, where sympathetic local juries would almost certainly acquit, but in admiralty courts with no jury at all. From London, this is just closing a loophole. From Boston, it is something else entirely. It is Britain reaching directly into the way Nathaniel Cole does business and rearranging it without asking him. Without consulting his assembly, without any process that resembles the consent-based governance he has spent his entire life believing he lived under. He is not ruined by the Sugar Act, he is unsettled by it. There's a difference between a policy that hurts you and a policy that reveals something. The Sugar Act reveals something. Then comes 1765. The Stamp Act. This one is different in kind, not just degree. The Sugar Act was at least dressed as a trade regulation, part of a long tradition of Parliament managing imperial commerce. The Stamp Act is a direct internal tax. It requires a government stamp, purchased with real money, on every piece of printed paper in the colonies. Legal documents, newspapers, pamphlets, playing cards, diplomas, wills, contracts, everything. George Grenville, the Prime Minister who designs the Stamp Act, is not a cruel man. He is a careful, methodical, and deeply boring man who looks at a budget problem and applies what seems to him like an obvious solution. The colonists are among the least taxed people in the British Empire. A British subject living in England pays roughly 26 shillings a year in taxes. A colonist pays about 1 shilling. Grenville's stamp tax would raise that to perhaps 1.5 shillings. By any arithmetic, this is modest. He even gives the colonies a year's notice before the act takes effect, specifically inviting them to propose an alternative if they have one. They do not propose an alternative. They explode. James Otis Jr., a Boston lawyer who has already been arguing for years that taxation without representation is a form of tyranny, takes to the pamphlets with a fury that surprises even his allies. Patrick Henry, a 29-year-old Virginia lawyer serving in the House of Burgesses, stands up and delivers a speech so incendiary that members of his own assembly accuse him of treason. He responds, according to witnesses, by saying that if that be treason, make the most of it. Nathaniel Cole reads both men and feels something crystallize that has been forming since the Sugar Act. It is not just anger, it is recognition. The Stamp Act is not a mistake or an overreach by one bad minister. It is evidence of a structural reality that he has been refusing to see, that Parliament believes it can legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever, that the colonial assemblies he has served in and believed in are, in Parliament's view, advisory bodies at best. Local conveniences, not genuine legislatures with genuine authority. If that is true, and the Stamp Act strongly suggests it is, then everything Nathaniel believed about what it meant to be a British subject is wrong. He is not ready to say that yet. Very few people are, in 1765. But the Stamp Act Congress meets in October of that year. 9 colonies sending delegates to New York, the first intercolonial gathering of its kind, and produces a declaration stating, carefully but unmistakably, that the colonists possess all the rights of natural-born British subjects, and that taxation without consent is a violation of those rights. Notice what they are not saying. They are not saying they want independence. They are not rejecting Britain. They are demanding that Britain live up to what they believe Britain is supposed to be. In Edmund Graves reads the Stamp Act Congress Declaration in London and finds it baffling. In his view, Parliament represents all British subjects, including colonists. The idea that colonial assemblies have independent taxing authority is constitutionally absurd. Parliament is sovereign. That is the entire point of the Glorious Revolution settlement they all supposedly agree on. He cannot understand why the colonists are behaving as though they are being wronged, because from where he sits, they aren't. And that mutual incomprehension, Edmund genuinely baffled, the colonists genuinely outraged, both of them certain the other is being unreasonable, is exactly the gap we identified at the beginning of this story. It is widening now, visibly, dangerously. Where Britain repeals the Stamp Act in 1766 under enormous commercial pressure, colonial boycotts of British goods are hurting merchants in London and Bristol badly enough that Parliament blinks. The colonists celebrate. Church bells ring in Boston. William Hartwell raises a glass to King George III with something approaching genuine warmth. But Parliament cannot let the repeal stand alone. On the same day it repeals the Stamp Act, it passes the Declaratory Act, a short, blunt statement that Parliament has the authority to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. The colonists mostly ignore the Declaratory Act. They are too busy celebrating. They shouldn't have ignored it. Because 1 year later, in 1767, a man named Charles Townshend, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, and a man of considerable intelligence and almost no political judgment, decides to test that authority again. If the colonists object to internal taxes, he reasons, perhaps external ones, duties on imported goods, will be more acceptable. The Townshend Acts tax glass, paint, paper, and tea imported into the colonies. They are not acceptable, and this time the response from the colonies is not just loud, it is organized, it is sustained. And it introduces something new into the conflict, something that transforms it from a political argument into something that feels, for the first time, genuinely dangerous. It introduces the streets. Now, what you need to understand about the colonial response to the Townshend Acts, and this is something the textbook version almost never captures, is that it isn't just lawyers writing pamphlets and assemblymen passing resolutions. It's ordinary people, in public, together, and that changes everything. Boston, 1768, the Sons of Liberty, a network of political activists that has been organizing since the Stamp Act crisis, have by now developed something that looks, from one angle, like a grassroots protest movement, and from another angle, like an extremely effective intimidation operation. Samuel Adams, their most gifted organizer, understands something about political power that most of his contemporaries don't. That ideas don't move people. Emotions move people. And emotions are most powerful when they are shared in a crowd. So the Sons of Liberty organize. They hold public meetings. They circulate non-importation agreements, pledges by colonial merchants to stop buying British goods until the Townshend Acts are repealed. They publish lists of merchants who refuse to sign, and they make life very uncomfortable for those merchants. Nathaniel Cole signs the non-importation agreement. He signs it not because he agrees with everything Adams says. Adams is more radical than Nathaniel is comfortable with. But because not signing has become socially untenable. His neighbors are watching. His business partners have signed. There is a social pressure operating here that is distinct from the political pressure, and in some ways, more powerful. This is worth pausing on, because the non-importation movement is one of the most remarkable things that happens in the pre-revolutionary period, and it almost never gets the attention it deserves. Between 1768 and 1770, colonial imports of British goods dropped by nearly half. In some categories, they drop by more. The economic pressure on British manufacturers is severe enough that petitions flood Parliament from merchants in London, Bristol, Manchester, and Birmingham, the same commercial interests whose protests helped bring down the Stamp Act. The colonies have discovered that economic leverage is a weapon, and they are using it with increasing sophistication. Edmund Graves, watching this from London, is no longer merely baffled. He is alarmed. The non-importation movement is not a legal argument that can be answered with a counter-argument. It is an exercise of collective power that Parliament has no obvious mechanism to address. You cannot pass a law that forces people to buy things. But Parliament tries the next best thing. In 1768, responding to reports of increasingly turbulent conditions in Boston, the British government orders 2 regiments of regular troops to the city. 4,000 soldiers. In a city of 15,000 people. Think about what that means in practice. Not as a political fact, as a daily reality. You walk out of your house in the morning, and there are British soldiers on your street. They are billeted in your neighbors' homes because the Quartering Act requires colonists to provide housing and supplies for troops. They drill on the common. They patrol the docks. Their presence is constant, physical, impossible to ignore. For Nathaniel Cole, the soldiers are not just an inconvenience. They are a statement. They are Britain saying, without words, "We do not trust you. We consider you a population that requires military management. Whatever you believed about your status as free British subjects, this is what we actually think of you." He has never felt less British in his life. William Hartwell, 800 miles away in Virginia, reads the newspapers and feels a cold recognition. He has been filing things away for years. The contempt of the British officers during the war, the Stamp Act, the Declaratory Act, the Townshend duties. Each item, taken alone, seemed explicable. Taken together, they are forming a pattern he does not like. He writes in his journal, not for publication, but just for himself, that he is beginning to wonder whether Britain sees the colonies as partners or as property. He does not share this thought with anyone. It feels disloyal even to write it. Then comes the night of March 5th, 1770. A crowd of Boston workers, dock workers, rope makers, apprentices, the kind of men whose names never appear in the history books, but whose anger is the fuel that runs every revolution, gathers around a small group of British soldiers outside the Custom House on King Street. The crowd throws ice, oyster shells, and chunks of coal. They shout, they press in. A soldier, knocked to the ground, fires his musket. Other soldiers fire. When it is over, 5 colonists are dead. Crispus Attucks, a man of African and indigenous descent who worked the docks, is the first to fall. His death will become one of the most politically potent facts of the entire pre-revolutionary period, not because of who he was, but because of what his death proves. That British soldiers will fire on British subjects. That the occupation is not theoretical. That people can die. Samuel Adams, who has never let a crisis go to waste, calls it a massacre. Paul Revere makes an engraving that depicts disciplined British soldiers firing in cold blood on innocent civilians. The engraving is not entirely accurate. It is extraordinarily effective. The Boston Massacre. That is what it is called now, and that name alone is worth examining, because no one calls 5 deaths a massacre unless they want people to feel a specific thing. Travels through the colonies by newspaper and pamphlet within days. William Hartwell reads about it in Virginia and feels the thing he has been resisting for years finally break through. He is angry now, not confused, not puzzled, not willing to explain it away as individual bad behavior. Angry at Britain, at a relationship that has produced this. Soldiers on streets, dead men on cobblestones, and a parliament 3,000 miles away that still cannot understand why anyone is upset. The Townshend Acts are partially repealed in 1770, the same day as the Boston Massacre, in one of history's more ironic coincidences. With the exception of the tax on tea, which Parliament keeps specifically to preserve the principle that it can tax the colonies if it wants to. It is the most expensive cup of tea in history, because keeping that tea tax, that small symbolic an entirely unnecessary demonstration of parliamentary authority, plants the seed of the single event that makes revolution irreversible. The event that takes a political argument and turns it into a physical act that cannot be undone, cannot be apologized for, and cannot be answered with anything short of either complete British capitulation or complete British force. That event is 3 years away. But the fuse is burning now, and the most important thing that happens in those 3 years isn't a law or a speech or a battle. It's the slow, grinding, psychologically exhausting experience of living under occupation, of watching your city change around you, of feeling every single day the weight of being governed by a power that has made very clear it doesn't trust you, and of starting to ask for the first time a question that once would have been unthinkable. What exactly do we owe them? Let's talk about tea, not as a symbol, not as a metaphor, as the specific, almost accidental sequence of events that turned a political crisis into a constitutional rupture and made everything that followed not just possible, but, for the first time, genuinely likely. It is 1773. The British East India Company, one of the most powerful commercial entities in the world, a corporation so large it has its own army and governs vast territories in India, is in serious financial trouble. It is sitting on 18 million pounds of unsold tea in its London warehouses. The British government, which is deeply intertwined with the company's finances, needs to solve this problem. The solution they devise is the Tea Act of 1773. Here's the part that almost nobody explains properly. The Tea Act actually makes tea cheaper for the colonists. The East India Company is now allowed to sell directly to colonial retailers, cutting out the middlemen and reducing the price of legal tea below the price of smuggled Dutch tea, which the colonists have been buying for years to avoid the Townshend tea tax. From London, this looks like a gift. Edmund Graves cannot understand why anyone would object to cheaper tea. From Boston, it looks like a trap. And here is why. The cheaper tea comes with the Townshend tax still attached. If the colonists buy it, even though it costs less than smuggled tea, they are implicitly accepting Parliament's right to tax them. They are conceding the principle. For a penny saved on tea, they are surrendering the constitutional argument they have been making for 8 years. Samuel Adams sees this immediately. So does his network. So does virtually every colonial political thinker who has been engaged in this argument. The Tea Act is not generosity. It is a mechanism designed to get the colonists to accept taxation by making acceptance economically attractive. They are not going to accept it. On the night of December 16, 1773, a group of men, somewhere between 30 and 130, the historical record is imprecise, dressed loosely as Mohawk Indians board 3 ships in Boston Harbor: the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, the Beaver. In the space of about 3 hours, they open 342 chests of East India Company tea and throw every last one of them into the harbor. The 342 chests, 46 tons of tea, worth approximately 10,000 pounds, roughly $2 million in today's money. Every chest opened methodically, dumped, and the ships swept clean afterward. No other property damaged, no one hurt. It is one of the most disciplined acts of political vandalism in history. Nathaniel Cole does not participate directly. He is too prominent, too exposed, but he knows people who do. And when he hears about it the next morning, his reaction is not alarm. It is something closer to grim satisfaction. A line has been crossed. He knows that. There is no pretending now that this is a polite constitutional argument being conducted through proper channels. Something irreversible has happened. He is not entirely sure he minds. William Hartwell, reading the accounts in Virginia, feels a complicated mixture of admiration and dread. Admiration because after years of petitions and resolutions and pamphlets that have produced nothing, someone has finally done something. Dread because he understands, with the clarity of a man who has read his history, that acts like this do not produce conciliation. They produce responses. And the response from Britain is swift, furious, and catastrophically misjudged. Parliament passes 4 acts in the spring of 1774 that the colonists immediately dub the Intolerable Acts. Let's go through them, because each one is a masterclass in how to turn a crisis into a catastrophe. The Boston Port Act closes Boston Harbor entirely until the East India Company is compensated for its tea. Every ship, every dock. The city that depends on maritime trade for its economic life is simply shut down. Workers lose their jobs, merchants lose their livelihoods, families go hungry. The Massachusetts Government Act suspends the Massachusetts Colonial Charter, the foundational document of self-governance that the colony has operated under for generations, and places the colony under direct royal control. The governor is now appointed by the Crown. Town meetings, which have been the basic unit of Massachusetts democracy since the 17th century, are restricted to 1 meeting per year without royal approval. The Administration of Justice Act allows royal officials accused of crimes in Massachusetts to be tried in Britain or in other colonies, effectively placing them beyond the reach of local justice. The Quartering Act expanded. Act requires colonists to house British soldiers in occupied buildings, including private homes if necessary. Edmund Graves reads these acts and finds them proportionate. The Tea Party was an act of lawless destruction. Order must be restored. The guilty must be punished. The authority of Parliament must be reasserted. He would use different words than intolerable acts. He would call them the coercive acts, which is what Parliament actually names them, and he would consider that an accurate description of their purpose. Coercion. Yes, that is what is required. What Edmund cannot see, what virtually no one in London can see, is that the Intolerable Acts do the one thing that no amount of colonial organizing had managed to do in the previous decade. They unite the colonies, not against a tax, not against a specific policy, and against a principle, against the demonstrated willingness of Britain to suspend self-governance entirely when the colonists prove inconvenient. Before the Intolerable Acts, the colonial resistance is a Massachusetts problem with sympathizers elsewhere. After the Intolerable Acts, it is a continental problem. Colonies that have had almost nothing to do with the Boston Tea Party, Georgia, the Carolinas, the Middle Colonies, send food and supplies to Boston under the closed port. They do this not because they love Boston, and many of them don't. They do it because the message of the Intolerable Acts is not, Boston will be punished. The message is, any colony that steps out of line can have its charter suspended and its city strangled. That message lands. In September 1774, delegates from 12 colonies gather in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. Not to declare independence, the word is still barely spoken, but to coordinate a response, to draft a unified statement of colonial rights, and to organize a continent-wide boycott of British goods that makes the earlier non-importation movements look tentative. William Hartwell, now serving as a Virginia delegate, sits in Carpenter's Hall in Philadelphia and looks around the room. He sees men from Massachusetts and New York and Pennsylvania and the Carolinas, men he has never met, men whose accents and cultures and economic interests differ substantially from his own, and feels something he has not felt before, not just colonial, American. He does not use that word yet. Almost no one does. But the feeling is there. The sense that the thing they share is no longer simply British identity, because British identity has been doing nothing but disappointing them, but something newer, less defined, and in this moment, surprisingly powerful. Edmund Graves, reading the reports of the Continental Congress in London, feels a chill that has nothing to do with the November weather. This is no longer a tax dispute. This is an organized, continent-wide political movement with its own institutions, its own communication networks, its own economic leverage. He writes in a letter to a colleague that he fears Britain has miscalculated badly. He is right. But the question now, the question that will determine everything, is whether it is too late to correct the mistake. Whether there is still a version of this story where Britain and the colonies find their way back to each other. Where some act of political imagination, some genuine offer of reconciliation, pulls them back from the edge. There is one last chance. One final moment where the tragedy might still be averted. It is slipping away faster than anyone realizes. We have arrived at the part of the story that historians tend to rush past. Because what happens between the First Continental Congress in September 1774 and the first shots at Lexington in April 1775 is not dramatic. There are no famous battles, no iconic moments, no lines that end up on posters. What there is instead is something more interesting and more heartbreaking than any of that. There is a genuine attempt, fragile, imperfect, probably doomed, but real, to stop what is coming. And understanding why it fails tells you more about the true causes of the American Revolution than any tax or any act of Parliament ever could. In London, in the winter of 1774 and into 1775, there are men who understand that something has gone catastrophically wrong and are trying, desperately and too late, to fix it. William Pitt, the Earl of Chatham, the man who had led Britain to victory in the 7 Years' War and who commands enormous respect on both sides of the Atlantic, rises in the House of Lords in January 1775 and delivers a speech that should have changed everything. He tells Parliament, with the authority of the man who knows Britain's power better than anyone, that the colonies cannot be conquered, that the attempt to coerce them will fail, that the Intolerable Acts must be repealed, that some form of colonial representation or formal recognition of colonial rights must be offered, not as concession, but as statesmanship. He proposes a specific plan. The Continental Congress would be recognized as a legitimate body. Colonial taxation for defense would be agreed upon by the colonies themselves through their own assemblies. Parliamentary supremacy would be maintained in principle, but exercised with restraint in practice. It is not a perfect plan. It papers over the fundamental constitutional disagreement rather than resolving it. But it is something. It is a hand extended across the water. Parliament rejects it, not narrowly, by a wide margin. The mood in Parliament is not conciliation, it is punishment. Lord Sandwich, the First Lord of the Admiralty, responds to Pitt's proposal by suggesting it must have been written by an American, meaning it as an insult. The Duke of Richmond warns that Pitt's plan will be seen as weakness. Edmund Graves, listening in the gallery, feels something he has not felt before in this entire crisis. Doubt. Not about Parliament's authority, he still believes in that completely, but about Parliament's judgment, about whether the men making these decisions actually understand what they are dealing with. Pitt has fought wars. Pitt has governed an empire. Pitt is telling them this will not work, and they are dismissing him. Edmund goes home that evening and sits for a long time without lighting the lamps. In Philadelphia, the Continental Congress has sent a petition directly to King George III, the Olive Branch Petition, drafted largely by John Dickinson of Pennsylvania, who represents the significant portion of colonial opinion that still genuinely does not want independence and is willing to say so explicitly. The petition reaffirms colonial loyalty to the Crown. It asks only that the king intervene personally, use his royal authority to restrain Parliament and open negotiations. It is, by any measure, a moderate document, a document written by men who are trying to find a way out. George III refuses to receive it. He does not read it. He does not respond to it. He simply declines to acknowledge its existence. In August 1775, he issues a proclamation of rebellion, declaring the colonies to be in a state of rebellion and calling on loyal subjects to report traitors. Nathaniel Cole reads the proclamation of rebellion in his counting house in Boston and feels the last thing he expected to feel at this moment. Relief, not happiness, not triumph. Relief. The particular exhausted relief of a man who has been dreading a conversation for years and who has now finally been told it is never going to happen. The king has spoken. There will be no negotiation. There will be no recognition. There will be force or there will be submission. He has known, somewhere underneath everything, that this was where it was going. The proclamation simply removes the last reason to pretend otherwise. William Hartwell writes to his brother in Virginia, "The question is no longer whether we can preserve our rights within the empire. The question is whether we have the courage to preserve them outside it." He does not use the word independence, but he means it. And here is the thing that makes this moment truly tragic. The thing that keeps it from being a simple story of tyranny defeated by righteousness. There are historians who argue convincingly that even at this late stage, even after Lexington and Concord, even after the battles of 1775, reconciliation was not impossible. That a genuine offer of colonial representation in Parliament, or a formal acknowledgement of colonial assembly rights, or almost any substantive gesture of recognition might have fractured the colonial coalition. That the men like Dickinson and Hartwell, who still wanted accommodation, were more numerous than the men like Adams who wanted independence, and that a serious British offer might have empowered them. It never came, and not because the British were monsters, but because the British, Parliament, the King, the Ministry, never fully believed that the colonists meant it. They had backed down before. They had repealed the Stamp Act. They had partially repealed the Townshend Acts. And every time they backed down, the colonial resistance had regrouped and escalated. From London, this looked like a pattern of manipulation. Back down, demand more. Back down again. That rewarded only firmness. From the colonies, the exact same sequence of events looked like a pattern of broken promises. Offer, retract, promise, betray. That proved Britain could never be trusted. Same events, opposite lessons. That is the tragedy. Not malice, not stupidity. Two sides of the same family, reading the same history and reaching opposite conclusions. Until the gap between their conclusions became wider than any bridge either side was willing to build. The last chance is gone now. What comes next is not a cause of the revolution. It is the revolution itself. But before we get there, before Lexington and Concord and the Declaration and the war, there is one more thing we need to understand, one more layer underneath all of this. Because this whole story, the taxes, the occupation, the Tea Party, the Intolerable Acts, the failed reconciliation, all of it is the surface, the visible part, the part that made it into the history books. Underneath all of it, something deeper has been happening, something that no act of Parliament caused and no act of Parliament could have stopped, something that was always going to end here. The colonists have stopped being British. Not because of the taxes just proved it. Let's talk about when it actually happened and why. Here is something that almost nobody asks about the American Revolution, and that turns out to be maybe the most important question of all. When, exactly, did the colonists stop thinking of themselves as British? Not when did they declare independence? That's 1776 and we know it. But when did the internal shift happen? When did the identity change? When did men like Nathaniel Cole and William Hartwell stop being British subjects who had grievances and start being something else? Something that didn't yet have a name, but that was already unmistakably different. The answer is not a date. It is a process. And it starts much earlier than the taxes. You go back to the beginning of this story, to the 100 years of salutary neglect when Britain left the colonies to govern themselves. In that space, in that long, quiet century, The colonists did not just develop political institutions. They developed a culture, a way of life, a set of assumptions about what normal looked like. Normal looked like local control. Normal looked like elected assemblies that made decisions about local affairs. Normal looked like a man being judged by his neighbors in a local court, not shipped to London for trial. Normal looked like being able to expand westward, trade freely, build and grow and accumulate without asking permission from a government 3,000 miles away that had never seen your farm or your town or your children. This was not a radical vision. Yeah, it was just life as the colonists had lived it for 4 generations. And here's the psychological key to everything, the thing that unlocks the whole story. By the 1760s, when Parliament began trying to reassert authority, the colonists did not experience it as a new imposition. They experienced it as the removal of something they already had, something they had always had, something they had assumed was permanent. There is an enormous psychological difference between those two things. Being told you cannot have something you never had produces resentment. Being told you cannot have something you have had your entire life, that your parents had, that their parents had, that produces something much more volatile. It produces the sense that something is being stolen. Thomas Jefferson, writing in 1774 in a document called A Summary View of the Rights of British America, captures this feeling with a precision that no one had quite managed before. The colonists, he argues, did not receive their rights from the crown. They brought their rights with them across the ocean. Those rights, the right to self-governance, to property, to consent and taxation, were not gifts from a king. They were inherent in what it meant to be a free people. And a king or parliament that tried to take them was not exercising legitimate authority. It was committing theft. Jefferson is 21 years old when he first articulates this argument. It will become, 6 years later, the intellectual foundation of the Declaration of Independence. But in 1774, it is not yet revolutionary. It is the common sense of an entire generation of colonists who have arrived through their own experience and their own reading at the same conclusion. They are not British subjects in the way Parliament means. They never were. And here's where the cultural and psychological causes of the revolution become impossible to separate from the political and economic ones. Because the colonists who are resisting parliamentary authority in 1774 are not the same people who would have resisted it in 1674 or 1714. They have been shaped by a century of self-governance, by the experience of the French and Indian War, by the Enlightenment ideas circulating through colonial colleges and coffee houses and churches into something genuinely new. They are not British. They are not yet American. That word barely exists, but they are something. It's something that has its own assumptions, its own expectations, its own non-negotiable convictions about what a free life looks like. And Britain, by 1774, is threatening every single one of those convictions simultaneously. Nathaniel Cole sits in his counting house in the winter of 1774 and does something he has never done before. He thinks about the future, not his future, but his children's future, and for the first time in his life, the future he imagines does not involve Britain at all. He does not announce this, he does not write it down. It is simply a quiet internal shift, the moment when a man who has organized his entire identity around one thing begins, almost without noticing, to organize it around something else. He is not alone. Across the colonies, in drawing rooms and taverns and churches and town meetings, the same shift is happening in thousands of people simultaneously. The British identity that had been the organizing principle of colonial life for a century is not being rejected. It is being discovered to be hollow. To have always been hollow. To have been, as Patrick Henry puts it with characteristic bluntness, a lie they told themselves. This is not cause for celebration. It is cause for grief. William Hartwell, watching this happen in himself and around him, captures it in a letter to a friend in late 1774 that is one of the most human documents of the entire pre-revolutionary period. He writes that he feels as a man feels when he discovers that a friend he has loved for years has been speaking ill of him behind his back for just as long. Not angry at the revelation exactly, angry at himself for not seeing it sooner. So angry at the years he spent being loyal to something that was not loyal back. That feeling, that specific combination of grief and self-reproach and dawning, reluctant anger is the psychological cause of the American Revolution. Everything else is details. The Declaration of Independence, when it comes in 1776, is not a beginning. Everyone talks about it as a beginning, the birth of a nation, the dawn of a new era. But from the inside, from the perspective of the people who lived through everything we have just described, it feels like something else entirely. It feels like a funeral. The funeral of a relationship, of an identity, of 150 years of believing genuinely and earnestly and sometimes heartbreakingly that they were British, that they belonged to something larger than themselves, on something that shared their values and recognized their worth, and would ultimately, if pushed hard enough, do right by them. It didn't, and now they are burying it. Thomas Jefferson writes in the Declaration that all men are created equal, that they are endowed with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He is writing about universal principles, but he is also writing more personally about the specific experience of a specific people who have spent a generation discovering that the government they served did not believe those principles applied to them. The Declaration is a political document. It is also a breakup letter. And like all breakup letters, it is written partly to justify leaving, partly to explain why staying had become impossible, and partly, underneath all the careful legal language and the appeals to universal principle, to say, finally out loud, the thing that has been true for a long time but that nobody wanted to admit. It's over. We are something else now. We don't yet know exactly what, but we know what we are not. And understanding that, understanding the revolution not as a political event, but as an identity collapse, a psychological rupture, a funeral for a relationship that had been dying for decades, is what makes it possible to finally understand the most important question. Not just how it happened, but why it was always, in some ways, inevitable. And why, even at its most inevitable, it was also a tragedy. Because tragedies, by definition, are about things that didn't have to end the way they did. About moments where different choices might have led somewhere different. About the gap between what was and what might have been. There were different choices available, right up until there weren't. That's the final thing we need to reckon with, not just what caused the revolution, and we've covered that, but what it actually means and why, 250 years later, it still matters what we understand about it. So let's do the final reckoning. We've come a long way from the textbook version of this story. We've been back further than 1763, further than 1689, all the way to the boats and the first settlements and the 100 years of self-governance that built, without anyone realizing it, people who were never going to accept what Parliament tried to impose on them in 1764. We've watched Nathaniel Cole go from a proud, a loyal British merchant to a man whose future no longer includes Britain. We've watched William Hartwell file things away, the contempt of British officers, the Stamp Act, the soldiers in Boston streets, the king who wouldn't read the petition, until the file became too heavy to carry. We've watched Edmund Graves go from confident certainty to quiet doubt, writing in a letter to a colleague that Britain has miscalculated badly, still not fully understanding why. And now I want to tell you what the actual causes of the American Revolution were, not as a list, but as a portrait. Because a list makes it sound like a series of mistakes, and it was not primarily a series of mistakes. It was a structural failure. A failure so deep and so slow that nobody on either side recognized it until it was too late. Here is what actually caused the American Revolution. A century of salutary neglect created a politically experienced, self-governing people who had built genuine democratic institutions and genuine political expectations. Those institutions and expectations were not compatible with parliamentary sovereignty as Britain understood it. That incompatibility was invisible during the neglect because nobody was testing it. It became explosive the moment Britain started testing it. An idea, Locke's idea, the Glorious Revolution's idea, the idea that government requires consent, was taken by the colonists more seriously than Britain ever intended. Britain meant it to apply to Parliament's relationship with the English people. The colonists meant it to apply to their relationship with their own assemblies. Same idea, a completely different scope. That disagreement was never resolved because it was never honestly confronted. A war, the 7 Years' War, generated a debt that Britain needed to address and a set of military attitudes that poisoned the relationship between British soldiers and colonial populations. The debt produced the taxes. The attitudes produced the contempt. Both produced the conditions for everything that followed. A series of British responses, the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, the occupation of Boston, the Tea Act, the Intolerable Acts, were individually defensible and collectively catastrophic. Each one made sense from London. Each one landed in the colonies as further evidence of a fundamental truth the colonists were slowly and reluctantly accepting, that Britain did not see them as equals. And underneath all of it, underneath the economics and the politics and the constitutional arguments, an identity was dying. The British identity that had organized colonial life for a century was being revealed, act by act and year by year, to rest on a foundation that Britain did not share and had perhaps never shared. The colonists called themselves British. Britain called them colonists. That gap between what they thought they were and what Britain thought they were is where the revolution actually lived. Edmund Graves never fully understood this. He died in 1791, having spent his final years trying to make sense of how a perfectly reasonable series of parliamentary decisions had produced the loss of the most valuable colonies in the British Empire. He wrote a short memoir that was never published, in which he concluded that the fault lay primarily with agitators, Adams, Jefferson, Henry, who had manipulated an essentially loyal population into rebellion. He was wrong. But his wrongness is instructive because he was not a stupid man or a cruel one. He was a man who could not see past the assumption that had structured his entire understanding of the relationship. The assumption that the colonies were subordinate, that Parliament was sovereign, that loyalty was the natural default, and resistance was the aberration that required explanation. He never considered the possibility that from the other side, the exact same facts looked like sovereignty and resistance and loyalty to something that Parliament had never actually been. Nathaniel Cole lived until 1803. He saw the Revolution, the war, the Constitution, and the first administrations. He became, in his old age, something he would not have recognized in himself as a young man, a proud American, clear-eyed about what that meant and what it had cost. He kept, on the wall of his counting house, a copy of the Stamp Act, not as a grievance to nurse, but as a reminder of the moment when a policy stopped being a policy and became a revelation, of the specific point where a relationship that had been dying for 100 years finally admitted it was dead. William Hartwell's journal survives in fragments. The last entry, dated July 5th, 1776, the day after the Declaration was published, is 7 words long. It says, "It is done. God help us all. Not triumph, not celebration, grief and resolve, in equal measure." The complicated, exhausted, so clear-eyed feeling of a man who has arrived somewhere he never wanted to go, who understands exactly how he got there, and who knows that whatever comes next will be harder than anything that came before. That is the emotional truth of the American Revolution, not the textbook version, not the triumphant origin story, not the inevitable march of freedom against tyranny, a tragedy built slowly, over generations, by people on both sides who were mostly reasonable, mostly sincere, and almost entirely unable to see past their own assumptions long enough to understand what the other side was actually experiencing. The taxes were a cause. The constitutional arguments were a cause. The occupation and the massacre and the tea and the Intolerable Acts were causes. But the deepest cause, the one that made all the others inevitable once they arrived, was a relationship that had been built on a misunderstanding so fundamental that no single act of statesmanship could have corrected it once the pressure came. Britain thought the colonies were dependents who had been given rights. The colonists thought they were partners who had always had them. Both of them were certain they were right. Neither of them ever fully understood what the other one meant. And in that gap, that single, profound, century-old misunderstanding about what they were to each other, a revolution was born.